December 20th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The wind carried ice and diesel fumes across a shattered clearing. In the half-light of dawn, 10 Sherman tanks sat in silence, hulking silhouettes buried in frost and mud. Their engines refused to turn. Their crews huddled nearby, faces hollow from exhaustion, waiting for orders that would never come. A single man moved among them, sleeves rolled, hands black with oil and blood. He was not a commander, nor a gunner, nor a hero in any cinematic sense. He was a mechanic. His name barely registered in the company logs, but that morning he carried the burden of 10 dead machines and 1 collapsing front line. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German guns echoed, distant, deliberate. The enemy was advancing. Every tank that stayed silent meant another hole in the defense. In the mechanic's trembling hand, a spool of salvaged wire, stripped from a wreck, half melted, almost useless. He stared at it for a long moment, frost biting through his gloves, and then whispered, "We can make it work." By nightfall, that useless piece of wire would become the reason 10 Sherman tanks fought for 3 more days. And it began here, in the cold, the silence, and the smell of burned oil. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had turned into a brutal race of endurance. The Allies had broken through Normandy's beaches 6 months earlier, sweeping across France faster than even Eisenhower's planners expected. But that momentum came at a price. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Fuel convoys lagged behind. Maintenance units worked without rest. And the machines of liberation, the Sherman tanks, began to show their limits. The M4 Sherman was the armored backbone of the Allied push. Over 49,000 were built, a triumph of American industry, designed for mass production and mobility. It was a tank that could be shipped, repaired, and crewed faster than any other. But in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, its virtues met their breaking point. The Sherman's radial engines, originally built for aircraft, were rugged but temperamental in cold weather. Batteries died quickly, ignition wires cracked, and starters froze solid. Maintenance manuals warned that under extreme cold, engine starting becomes unreliable without external power. But by December 1944, external power was a luxury. That month, the German army launched its final major offensive on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. The American divisions holding the region, including the 10th Armored, the 101st Airborne, and scattered infantry units, suddenly found themselves encircled, undersupplied, and fighting for survival. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts vanished. Maintenance teams, usually miles behind the front, were forced into makeshift workshops inside barns, forests, and ruined villages. Every working tank mattered. Each one was a shield against collapse. The Sherman was reliable compared to many contemporaries, its mechanical systems simple enough to field repair. But that reliability had limits. Prolonged exposure to mud, ice, and constant movement under fire wore down wiring looms and distributor caps. Electrical systems shorted out. In freezing fog, condensation turned to frost inside junction boxes. One broken ignition wire could silence a 30-ton war machine. And so, in those desperate December days, the unseen war of the mechanics began. They were the grease monkeys of the battlefield, the ordnance crews and field maintenance companies that kept armor alive. They worked under artillery fire, patching bullet holes with welded scrap, scavenging parts from destroyed tanks, and cannibalizing wrecks to resurrect the living. Manuals offered procedures. reality offered chaos. In one small Belgian village, one such crew faced an impossible order: restore 10 Shermans in 24 hours. The tanks had been pulled from the line after repeated electrical failures. Starters burned, relays fried, wiring harnesses half-melted from overuse. Replacement parts were days away, buried behind snowed-in convoys and shell-damaged roads. The unit commander, a major whose name faded in the records, had one instruction: get them moving, or we lose the sector. It was here that a single mechanic, perhaps a corporal, perhaps even lower, decided to ignore procedure. He scoured the ruins of the repair yard for anything conductive: burnt cables, broken radio wire, even strands of communication line stripped from a wrecked half-track. The men around him watched with disbelief. You couldn't just patch a tank's ignition system with scrap wire. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't safe, and it wasn't supposed to work. But desperation doesn't read manuals. While frost crept across the steel hulls of the Shermans, he laid out what little he had, twisting lengths of corroded copper, soldering joints with a field torch, bypassing entire circuits in a tangle of improvised lines. To most, it looked like madness. To him, it was logic born of experience. He had seen engines die for reasons no engineer predicted, and live again through sheer stubbornness and wire. And as the artillery thundered closer that night, the men of the armored column began to realize survival might depend not on strategy, but on the hands of one exhausted mechanic. The cold deepened. The forest roared with distant armor. Somewhere beyond the fog, the German spearhead approached. And inside that ruined repair yard, a spark flickered from a half-dead battery, the faintest sign that one Sherman might yet breathe again. The fight to keep them alive had begun. The U.S. Army's armored divisions depended on a complex but fragile support system. Behind every combat battalion stood an entire chain of mechanics, drivers, welders, electricians, and logisticians, the invisible army that kept steel moving. Each armored division had an ordnance maintenance battalion, whose duty was to recover, repair, and return vehicles to combat readiness. They worked in shifts that never truly ended. Their garages were not buildings but mud pits and barns. Their supply lines were convoys crawling through artillery-shelled roads. When the front shifted, they packed their tools into trucks and followed. The manuals spoke of echelon maintenance, 4 escalating levels of repair. In reality, those lines blurred as chaos grew. First echelon meant basic field work by the tank crew themselves: refueling, oil changes, track repairs. Second echelon belonged to company mechanics who handled smaller breakdowns. By third echelon, repair units like our unnamed crew stepped in, tackling engine failures, transmission swaps, electrical faults, and anything that required real skill. Fourth echelon were supposed to be depots far behind the line. But in the Ardennes, the rear no longer existed. When the Germans broke through on December 16th, entire maintenance columns were cut off. Crews suddenly found themselves fighting just to protect their own workshops. Fuel dumps exploded, spare parts were abandoned, and trucks were commandeered to evacuate wounded instead of engines. In that chaos, each unit became its own island, surviving on whatever could be salvaged from wrecks or captured stores. The Sherman tanks, though designed for mass production, had countless variations: gasoline versus diesel engines, different ignition systems, unique wiring harnesses. Mechanics often joked that no 2 Shermans are the same. That joke became deadly serious when scavenging for parts. In the Belgian cold, the most common mechanical killer wasn't enemy fire, it was the weather. Batteries lost power in hours. Wires cracked like glass. The insulation on starter cables, made of rubber, became brittle under frost. If a tank stalled during combat, restarting it could take precious minutes. Under artillery or infantry attack, those minutes were fatal. The mechanic in our story, whoever he truly was, would have known this intimately. Perhaps he had served with an ordnance company attached to the 10th Armored Division or the 4th Armored Division, both engaged around Bastogne that week. Both divisions were caught in the same nightmare, holding lines against superior enemy armor, with little more than what they could keep running by hand. Inside the temporary repair yard, the crews had stripped the Shermans bare. Hatches open, side panels removed, tools scattered in the mud. The engines still turned, but the ignition circuits were dead. Starter relays had shorted from moisture, grounding the electrical flow. Without a spark, the engines were lifeless. The correct solution would be to replace the wiring harnesses, but there were none. The Germans had shelled the nearest supply depot days earlier. Communication lines were cut, and radio orders came sporadically, buried in static. So, as the situation worsened, the men turned to what they could find. Radio cables stripped from wrecked jeeps. Telephone wire scavenged from destroyed command posts. Even bits of barbed wire hammered straight and used as connectors. The workshop became a tangle of improvisation, a battlefield laboratory born from necessity. Each tank they revived meant one more barrier against German armor. And in that week, with Panzer Division and 2nd Panzer Division pressing toward Bastogne, every tank was irreplaceable. The German assault brought Panthers, faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything the Americans fielded. Yet the Allies held one decisive advantage: logistics. Not in numbers, but in mindset. Where the Germans demanded precision and uniformity, the Americans thrived on improvisation. They fixed, adapted, and improvised their way out of impossible problems. This spirit, of making things work with nothing, ran through every level of the Allied war machine. From Sherman crews welding extra armor plates to GIs wiring headlights as makeshift signal lamps, innovation became survival instinct. Our mechanics' wire fix wasn't an act of genius born in comfort. It was the result of exhaustion, instinct, and the refusal to accept defeat. In that wrecked yard, under enemy artillery and snow that fell like ash, he embodied the truth of the Allied advance. Technology mattered, but human ingenuity decided survival. By dawn of December 21st, the repairs were almost complete. The first engines coughed, sputtered, and finally roared. One after another, the Shermans came back to life, their patched wires trembling with every vibration. The men watched in disbelief. Against all logic, the tanks were ready. But now, with the German advance closing in and the sky darkening again, those revived machines would face the true test, the battle itself. The wire held. The tanks rolled forward. And 3 days of impossible survival were about to begin. War often forgets the hands that hold the wrench. The histories of the Ardennes are filled with generals, divisions, and armored thrusts, but behind every page of strategy lies the story of men who kept the machines breathing. The unnamed mechanic in this frozen yard was one of thousands. Young, uncelebrated, and far from home. His rank likely meant little: corporal, technician 5th grade, perhaps private 1st class, but his responsibility was immense. Each broken tank he repaired meant dozens of lives preserved. Each failure, another line collapsing under German fire. He had learned his craft not in factories, but in dirt. Field repairs were as much intuition as training. Soldiers joked that a good mechanic could feel when a tank was wrong, hear the offbeat of an idling engine, smell a burned coil before it failed. They were doctors of machinery, their patients made of steel and grease. For men like him, exhaustion was constant. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were cold. Shellfire was background noise. Yet their work demanded precision. A miswired line or loose bolt could doom a tank crew. And so, in the chaos of war, they found calm in repetition. The turn of a wrench, the crackle of solder, the hum of a restarted engine. When he picked up that roll of wire, a coil scavenged from wreckage and radio debris, it was not with hope, but duty. Hope was for soldiers on the front. Mechanics worked with certainty or not at all. The wire was corroded, its insulation stripped, but he knew its worth. Conductivity was conductivity, no matter how crude. He wasn't trying to perform a miracle. He was simply doing his job, the only way left to do it. And somehow, in that simplicity, he achieved the impossible. Tactically, 10 working Shermans could decide the fate of an entire sector. In December 1944, the American defensive line around Bastogne and its surrounding villages was fractured. The Germans pushed through with speed and coordination, using the forest cover and poor weather to conceal their movements. Allied air power was grounded by snow and cloud. Armor was the only answer to armor. For the 10th Armored Division, small armored task forces were scattered across the region, at places like Neuville, Wardin, and Foy, holding crossroads against overwhelming odds. Each task force might field a handful of tanks, supported by infantry and anti-tank guns. If any of those tanks failed to start or move, a defensive position could collapse in minutes. When 10 Shermans in a maintenance yard went dead simultaneously, it wasn't a technical inconvenience, it was a tactical crisis. Without them, a flank would open. A road could be lost. A retreat might become a rout. The Germans, led by experienced Panzer crews, exploited such weaknesses ruthlessly. Their doctrine relied on speed, shock attacks that overwhelmed before a response could form. The Americans, by contrast, fought through endurance and adaptability. They patched together new defensive lines from whatever remained functional. That is why those 10 tanks mattered. Once repaired, they were likely rushed straight from the yard to the front, engines still sputtering, wiring still exposed, snow melting off their hulls as they climbed the ridgeline. Their crews knew the repairs were improvised, unreliable. But reliability was a luxury. Movement was survival. When those tanks opened fire again, the Germans facing them could not have known that their enemy's armor ran on a strand of wire and a mechanic's willpower. From their perspective, the American defense simply refused to break. 10 tanks, in the right place, at the right time, could blunt an entire armored assault. And so, in the tactical chessboard of the Ardennes, one mechanic's improvisation became an invisible move, one that kept a line intact when every calculation said it should have fallen. The Sherman was an engineering compromise, fast to build, simple to maintain, but vulnerable to damage. Its engine bay was a nest of cables, pipes, and fuel lines, packed tightly beneath the armor. Under ideal conditions, it worked flawlessly. Under the conditions of the Ardennes, mud, moisture, and cold, it was a nightmare. Electrical faults were especially lethal. The Sherman's ignition relied on a starter solenoid and magneto system that required steady current to ignite the cylinders. Any disruption, a cracked wire, corroded contact, or moisture short, meant the tank would not start. In sub-zero temperatures, those faults multiplied. Batteries lost amperage. Spark plugs froze. The simplest breakdowns became unsolvable when replacement parts vanished. The wire fix, as it was later described in ordnance notes, was a crude but effective bypass. By stripping the insulation off salvaged copper wire, the mechanic could directly bridge damaged circuits. It was dangerous. A single spark could ignite leaking fuel vapors. But it worked. He effectively rewired ignition systems by hand, creating a parallel circuit that allowed current to flow straight from the battery to the starter, bypassing burnt-out relays. It was an act of field engineering so bold that no manual would have permitted it. Yet this improvisation reflected the broader truth of wartime innovation. Technology on paper rarely survived contact with reality. Soldiers, facing failure, turned invention into instinct. This field modification, made with scraps, under shell fire, embodied the very essence of Allied engineering, flexibility. By the time those Shermans rolled out of the yard, their electrical systems were barely regulation. But they ran. They fought. And for 3 days, the patchwork of wire and solder held through snow, recoil, and fire. Those tanks were not just machines. They were monuments to human adaptability, living proof that even in the machine age of war, survival still depended on the human touch. The battle would soon test those repairs beyond all reason, a test written in smoke, fire, and steel. Leadership in war is often judged by victories and defeats, but in the frozen nightmare of the Ardennes, it was measured by endurance, by who could keep men fighting when logic said to stop. The officer overseeing that small maintenance unit faced an impossible equation. 10 tanks out of commission meant a hole in the line. But ordering his mechanics to fight a lost cause risked lives for machines that might never move again. Still, he made the decision, not because of orders from above, but because of belief in the men below. In those days, field leaders knew the value of trust. The war had turned soldiers into problem solvers, and the best officers learned when to step back. A lieutenant or major with experience in armor would know that a mechanic's intuition could mean more than any supply report. When he gave that single, understated order, "Get them moving," he was placing the fate of a sector in the hands of one man and a handful of tools. There would be no supervision, no oversight, no replacement parts. Just faith. Leadership in crisis is rarely loud. It is quiet, steady, and deliberate. The kind that recognizes capability, not just rank. And in that yard, under falling snow, that trust became the invisible bridge between command and chaos. The officer had no way of knowing that his decision would ripple through the coming battle, that those 10 tanks, revived by a mechanic's defiance, would hold the line for 3 critical days. His leadership didn't just issue an order, it empowered ingenuity. And in the harsh logic of war, that was leadership at its purest. To understand what those 10 Shermans faced, one must look through the eyes of their enemy, the German tankers of December 1944. The Panzer divisions advancing through the Ardennes were among Germany's last concentrated armored forces. After months of retreat, they were now thrown into a desperate counterattack, Hitler's final gamble to turn the war's tide. Among them fought veterans of the 2nd Panzer, Panzer and 12th SS Panzer divisions, many driving formidable Panther tanks. Technically superior to the Sherman in almost every metric, firepower, armor, optics, the Panthers were engineered for dominance. But their perfection was fragile. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm guns could tear through a Sherman at over a mile. Yet their engines were delicate, their transmissions unreliable, and their fuel consumption crippling. For every Panther that reached the front, another broke down on the way. The Germans relied on shock, the sudden collapse of American positions before logistics could respond. Their doctrine counted on momentum. But at Bastogne, that momentum faltered. Part of that failure was due to resistance from small, improvised strongpoints, places where few tanks or guns held against overwhelming odds. To the German commanders, it seemed irrational, American units refusing to break despite encirclement, cold, and dwindling supplies. Those 10 resurrected Shermans likely formed one such strong point. To the enemy's view, they were simply tanks that refused to die. Their armor, pitted and scarred, rolled out of the fog again and again, machines they believed destroyed returning to fight hours later. The Germans could not know that those tanks were held together by makeshift wiring, by soldered joints made under shell fire, by the will of a single mechanic who refused to stop. From the German perspective, the American war machine seemed endless, tanks appearing faster than they could be destroyed, defenses reforming when none should exist. But it was not endless. It was held together by ingenuity, luck, and defiance, by the smallest acts that the enemy could neither see nor comprehend. War's morality rarely reveals itself in grand gestures. It hides in the quiet choices made far from glory, choices that decide whether men live another hour. For the mechanic, morality was not about victory or politics. It was about duty to the men who would climb back into those tanks. He knew them, by name, by habit, by the grease stains they left on his tools. They trusted him, because their lives depended on the hum of an engine he had repaired. When he worked that night, his motivation was not heroism. It was obligation. To fail meant to send friends into battle unprotected. To succeed meant giving them a chance. That sense of moral duty, small, personal, and fierce, defined the Allied soldier as much as any ideology. In a war fought for continents, it was individual integrity that carried the burden of victory. The wire fix was not just mechanical improvisation. It was an act of moral defiance against despair. It said, "We will fight with what we have. We will make it work. We will not surrender." The following days would prove that sentiment right, and terrible. Those 10 Shermans, patched and trembling, would meet the full weight of the German assault. Their success would not be measured in triumph, but in survival, in holding a frozen line long enough for others to regroup. And through that ordeal, the moral heartbeat of the story would remain the same. That sometimes the smallest human act, one spool of salvaged wire, one man's refusal to quit, can shape the outcome of battles history barely remembers. The engines were running. The men were ready. And now, as dawn approached, the enemy was closing in. The next hours would decide everything. December 21st, 1944, outskirts of Bastogne. Dawn rose pale and soundless, spreading across the Ardennes like frost over broken glass. Snow drifted through the tree line, coating the hulls of the waiting Shermans. 10 of them stood in a ragged line, engines rumbling unevenly, steam rising from exhausts that coughed and spat. Their patched wires trembled beneath the armor, buzzing faintly with each turn of the crank. The mechanic, his hands wrapped in torn gloves, moved between the tanks one last time. He listened, feeling for rhythm, for any irregular beat. A tap on a distributor cap, a twist of a wire, a nod to the crewman watching from the hatch. Each sound mattered. Each vibration was a question of life or death. At 8 o'clock, the first shells landed. German artillery swept the tree line, hammering the ground with bursts of snow and earth. Panthers were coming, their engines deep, mechanical growls echoing through the valley. Through binoculars, an American lieutenant could see movement on the far ridge, dark silhouettes, low and angular, advancing with the confidence of superiority. The Shermans roared to life, or tried to. One sputtered, another hesitated, but the improvised circuits held. The mechanic watched as each tank rolled forward, treads biting into frozen mud. 10 of them, 10 that should have been silent, now moving toward the sound of the enemy. The first exchange came swift. A Panther fired from 800 yards, a clean shot. The shell screamed across the snow, striking a Sherman at the edge of the formation. The tank lurched, smoke billowed, but it didn't burn. The crew reversed into cover, firing back with its 75mm gun. The shell bounced harmlessly off the Panther's glacis, but the message was clear: the line would not break. Inside the tanks, crews worked in near darkness, eyes burning from fumes, hands numb from cold. They trusted their machines with blind faith, unaware of how fragile the wiring beneath them truly was. Each ignition spark, each electric pulse, was a miracle balanced on copper thread. The mechanic crouched behind a wrecked jeep, shielding his face from falling debris. He could no longer repair anything. His job was done. Now he watched his work fight for survival. Every flash of cannon fire lit up the sky like a welding torch, illuminating the trembling patchwork of his repair yard. For the next hour, chaos ruled. The Shermans maneuvered in pairs, leapfrogging through snow-covered fields. Each shot from their short-barreled 75s forced the Germans to pause, buying precious seconds. The terrain, narrow roads, hedgerows, and pine forests favored defense. Panthers struggled to turn their guns fast enough. At one point, a Sherman's engine cut out, dead silence in the middle of combat. The driver slammed the starter switch. Nothing. Again. Nothing. A third time, a spark. The engine screamed back to life, coughing smoke as it lurched forward. Somewhere inside that tank, a single strand of wire carried enough current to bring 30 tons of steel back into motion. The mechanic exhaled, unaware that the faintest tremor in that line had decided the life of 5 men. By midday, the battle line had stabilized. German armor stalled against stubborn resistance. The Shermans, patched and limping, still fired from their makeshift positions. Each tank bore scars, chipped paint, cracked fenders, frozen treads, but none were silent. Radio chatter filled the airwaves. Field commanders reported tanks operational, position held, enemy repelled. No one mentioned how. No one asked why the engines sounded offbeat, why their electrical systems sparked under recoil. All that mattered was that they still fought. The mechanic finally sat down, his back against a splintered beam. The ground shook with distant shell bursts. He pulled his gloves off. His hands were bleeding where the wire had cut through days earlier. He smiled faintly, eyes half closed, listening to the sound he loved more than any, the deep, rhythmic growl of engines running. He knew it couldn't last. The patchwork repairs would fail eventually. They always did. But for now, for this moment, they held. Above the smoke and snow, the faint rumble of American reinforcements could be heard. Armor from other sectors was moving to plug the gap. The 10 Shermans had done their job. But the battle wasn't over. The German counterattack would come again, stronger, more desperate. And for the next 2 days, those same 10 tanks, powered by nothing more than salvaged wire and stubbornness, would fight a battle that history would almost forget. The next dawn would test both man and machine beyond endurance. December 22nd to 24th, 1944. The snow never stopped. By the second morning, the yard that had once been a workshop was now a battlefield. Shell fragments embedded in the frozen ground. Burnt-out vehicles lay scattered like monuments to exhaustion. Somewhere amid it all, the 10 Shermans still stood, scarred, blackened, patched beyond reason, but alive. They had become a mobile wall for the infantry pinned along the road to Bastogne. Every time the Germans attacked, the Shermans moved to meet them, their engines groaning, their hulls vibrating from recoil. The improvised wiring circuits that the mechanic had installed buzzed with each ignition spark, threads of salvaged copper carrying the current of defiance. On the morning of the 22nd, a company of Panzer IVs and assault guns struck from the east. Snow muffled the sound of their approach until the first shell landed among the trees. Within seconds, the forest erupted in chaos, white smoke, black fire, and the deep roar of engines fighting to stay alive. The Shermans shifted positions constantly, using the terrain as their armor. They fired from behind ridge lines, reversed, and struck again. Their rounds might not have pierced Panther armor head-on, but in the tight valleys and narrow roads of the Ardennes, every shot counted. The Germans couldn't advance. Inside the tanks, the men fought exhaustion more than fear. For every burst of cannon fire, there came silence, long minutes of waiting, praying the next shell wouldn't hit. Each time they turned the ignition, they held their breath, knowing that the fragile wiring beneath could fail at any second. By nightfall, 2 Shermans were disabled, one with a thrown track, another with a jammed turret. Both were pulled behind the line. The mechanic, still working in the bitter cold, crawled inside the hulls to inspect the damage. His torchlight flickered across a tangle of scorched cables. The insulation had melted, and arcs of current had scorched the steel. He didn't stop. Using what little wire remained, he spliced new lines by feel, soldering them with a candle flame and pure will. The repairs were crude, but the engines restarted. When the tank commander shouted, "Good to go," the mechanic didn't even answer, just moved to the next machine. On the third day, the battle reached its height. German forces pressed harder, bringing in Stu-G 3 assault guns and heavy mortars. The sky was a blur of tracer fire and snowflakes, indistinguishable in the blinding haze. The Shermans fired until their barrels glowed faintly red, until their loaders' arms gave out from fatigue. By now, their electrical systems were hanging by a thread. Sparks flashed inside the driver's compartment when the switches were thrown. Smoke leaked from the control panels. Yet somehow, impossibly, they kept running. At one desperate moment, a tank stalled mid-fight. The crew bailed out, certain it was lost. But the mechanic sprinted forward through machine gun fire, climbed onto the engine deck, and jammed his frozen hands into the open panel. With a single twist of the salvaged wire, one he'd cut from a destroyed Jeep the day before, the engine caught again. The tank roared back to life. He dropped to the ground as it lurched forward, spitting snow and smoke, its gun firing into the tree line. That single act, unseen by commanders, unrecorded in reports, helped close the gap just long enough for the line to hold. For 72 hours, the sound of those 10 engines never truly stopped. They idled through the nights, lest the cold kill their batteries for good. Crews slept in shifts, wrapped in blankets that smelled of oil and fear. The mechanic barely slept at all. His hands blistered from heat and frost in equal measure, fingertips raw from twisting wire until it cut skin. On the evening of December 24th, as the fighting eased and the sky finally cleared, distant aircraft could be heard, Allied supply planes, bringing the first relief to Bastogne. The siege was breaking. Reinforcements were moving in. The 10 Shermans had done their job. They had held a sector that was never meant to hold. When silence finally fell, the mechanic stood among them, surrounded by the machines he had kept alive with nothing more than scavenged copper and sheer defiance. Snow clung to the barrels, engine heat rising in faint waves. 9 of the 10 tanks still ran. One burned quietly at the tree line, its crew lost. The rest were battered but functional, symbols of endurance in a war that devoured machines faster than they could be built. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply looked at the wire still coiled around his wrist, blackened, frayed, and almost useless. Almost. He cut a small piece from it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The sound of distant engines, real reinforcements, fresh armor, grew louder. The line had survived long enough for the tide to turn. And as the mechanic finally sat on a spent shell crate, hands shaking, he realized the truth. In a war of giants and machines, survival had come down to a single spool of wire and the stubborn will of men who refused to let their engines die. The battle for Bastogne would go down in history as a symbol of endurance, but within it lay hundreds of smaller battles like this one, unrecorded, unremembered, yet vital. This was one of them. And now, as the smoke cleared over the snow, the cost of that endurance would begin to unfold. When the guns finally fell silent on Christmas morning, the Ardennes forest looked like the graveyard of an army. The snow was no longer white. It was grey, laced with soot, oil, and blood. Sherman tracks cut through the frozen mud like scars that led nowhere. The mechanic stood among what remained, 9 tanks still breathing faintly, their engines idling in the cold like exhausted hearts. Around them, infantrymen emerged from dugouts and shell holes, faces hollow, eyes blinking against the pale light. For the first time in days, there was no thunder of artillery. Reports came in through broken radios. The German advance had stalled. Reinforcements from Patton's Third Army had reached Bastogne from the south. The siege was ending. The American lines had bent but not broken. For the men who had fought here, victory felt nothing like triumph. It felt like survival. The tank crews climbed out of their machines, stretching stiff limbs, moving with disbelief that they were still alive. Their vehicles bore the marks of hell, shrapnel dents, cracked armor plates, scorched paint. Yet the engines still ran, humming through the crude patchwork of wires that had kept them alive. The mechanic went from one tank to the next, checking them out of habit. He pressed his ear to the hull, felt the vibration of the engines, tightened a bolt or two. The soldiers called him Doc, though he wasn't one. To them, he was the man who'd saved their lifeline. One crewman handed him a dented canteen cup filled with lukewarm coffee. He took it without a word. His gloves were gone, his fingertips black with grime. When he finally looked up, the horizon was lit with the faint orange of distant fires, the front still burning miles away. Later, as the unit's commander made his rounds, he stopped beside the mechanic. No ceremony, no speech, just a nod. The kind of acknowledgement that passes between soldiers who have both seen the edge and stepped back from it. In the days that followed, the tanks were officially logged as repaired in field, serviceable. No mention of the improvisation, no note about the wire fix, no record of how close they had come to failure. Military paperwork didn't have space for miracles. The mechanic's name, if it was ever recorded, disappeared into the endless lists of maintenance personnel and ordnance companies. Thousands like him worked in the same anonymity. They kept the war machine alive, one weld, one bolt, one salvaged part at a time. But for the men who fought inside those Shermans, his work was legend. They told the story among themselves, about the man who brought 10 dead tanks back to life with scrap wire. It spread through nearby units like a whispered tale of impossible luck. In war, morale is often built not on facts, but on stories of human defiance. As the wounded were evacuated and the dead counted, the mechanic returned to his tools. There were always more engines waiting, more machines to mend. He didn't ask for recognition. He only asked for more wire. That night, he sat alone beside a still-running tank, the engine's warmth radiating against the bitter cold. Snowflakes fell onto the steel and melted instantly. The sound of the motor, uneven but steady, was the most human sound left in the forest. He listened for a long time. Then, finally, he closed his eyes. The battle was over, but the war rolled on. And somewhere inside the humming of that tank, you could still hear it, the pulse of endurance, kept alive by the hands of one quiet man. The days after Bastone's relief were strangely quiet. The soldiers who had survived the siege found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been Europe's deadliest battlefield. The forests that had thundered with the advance of the Wehrmacht were now still, filled only with the clatter of recovery crews and the hiss of melting snow dripping from burned trees. For the Allied command, Patton's arrival on December 26th marked a turning point. His tanks broke through the southern corridor, linking with the besieged 101st Airborne. The German offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, began to crumble. The failure to seize Bastogne shattered their timetable, starving the offensive of fuel, time, and momentum. But on the ground, where the fighting had been personal and brutal, victory was measured in smaller ways. A working tank, a full magazine, a man still breathing. The 10 Shermans that had fought on the Bastogne perimeter were soon folded back into their armored battalion. They were battered and unreliable, yet they became symbols among the crews, machines that should have died but didn't. Soldiers painted small nicknames on their hulls: Lucky Wire, Hold Fast, Iron Angel. When new replacement tanks arrived, some crews refused to give theirs up. One driver wrote home that his tank had earned its soul. Another told an army journalist that she kept running on hope and copper. The mechanic never corrected them. He continued his work in silence, following the battalion as it pushed eastward in January 1945. Each morning he checked the engines, feeling the same pulse of vibration through the armor, proof of life in a world designed for destruction. By February, the story of his wire miracle had reached other maintenance units. Commanders used it as an example of battlefield improvisation, a lesson in how ingenuity could offset scarcity. But like many stories in war, its details blurred with time. Names faded. Places were confused. What remained was the essence, that a man with a spool of salvaged wire had kept 10 tanks fighting long enough to hold a line. Military historians often focus on strategy and leadership, the movements of armies, the decisions of generals. Yet the war was sustained by thousands of invisible hands. Mechanics who rebuilt transmissions under fire. Medics who worked in foxholes by candlelight. Radio operators who twisted broken circuits to reach command posts miles away. The Battle of the Bulge was won not just by armor and artillery, but by the refusal of ordinary men to let their machines, or each other, fall silent. In the official reports, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps noted that field improvisations played a decisive role in maintaining armored strength during the Ardennes counteroffensive. It was a sterile phrase for what it meant in practice. Men working in the freezing dark, reanimating lifeless steel. Some years later, veterans would gather to remember Bastogne. They spoke of the paratroopers who held the town, of Patton's dash through the snow, of the stubbornness that turned disaster into endurance. And sometimes, in quieter moments, someone would mention the mechanic, a man whose name most couldn't recall, who fixed the unfixable. They would smile faintly, shake their heads, and say he was the kind of soldier wars are built on but history forgets. No photograph remains of him. No medal was ever issued. But in the Army's post-war archives, buried among hundreds of technical memos, a small handwritten note survives on a maintenance log. Temporary ignition repairs. Functional. Equipment remained operational for 3 days under combat conditions. That line, 12 words, is all that officially exists. Yet behind it lies a story of endurance stronger than any steel the factories ever made. The wire fix, born from desperation and frost, had kept 10 Shermans in the fight. In doing so, it helped hold the line that allowed Patton's armor to break through. And that, in turn, helped shape the outcome of the last great German offensive of the war. From that frozen patch of forest near Bastogne, the ripples spread outward, to every soldier who survived because a tank was there when it needed to be, and every mechanic who learned that sometimes ingenuity was the sharpest weapon of all. The war would grind on for months, but after Bastogne, its end was inevitable. And as the front moved east and the snow melted into mud, one small truth endured in the hearts of those who'd seen it. Victory had many fathers, but survival often came down to one man, one moment, and a single strand of wire. War is often remembered through grand strategies and famous names. Maps with arrows. Speeches from generals. Victory parades under clear skies. But beneath all that, beneath the noise of tanks, the roar of aircraft, and the machinery of nations, there is the quiet world of the ordinary soldier. The man with his hands in the mud, his breath frozen in the air, fighting not for glory, but to keep something alive just a little longer. The story of that mechanic near Bastogne is one of thousands that never made the headlines. His name may be gone, his deeds reduced to a single line in a maintenance log. Yet in those 3 days, when the snow fell and the world seemed to collapse around him, he embodied the simple, unbreakable truth of human endurance. He wasn't trying to win a battle. He was trying to make something work. And sometimes, that's what wins wars. 10 tanks held their line because one man refused to give up on them. Their engines, patched, humming, defiant, became the heartbeat of a defense that refused to die. In the frozen silence of the Ardennes, they proved that victory isn't always forged in command tents or plotted on maps. Sometimes it's wired together in the dark by hands that won't stop shaking. History often forgets such moments, but the machines remember. In every war, progress depends not only on the brilliance of leaders or the strength of machines, but on the stubbornness of those who keep both moving when everything falls apart. That's the legacy of that mechanic, and of countless others like him. Not glory, not fame, but motion, against all odds, through all fear. A single strand of wire, salvaged from wreckage, carried the current of survival through 3 days of war. And though time has buried his name, the echo of that defiance still hums in the engines of history.